In the thin triangular lamina, the obex. The non-nervous part of the roof is formed by the epithelial lining of the ventricle, which is prolonged downward as a thin membrane from the deep surface of the posterior medullary velum to the corresponding surface of the obex and tenae, and thence on to the floor of the ventricular cavity. It is covered and strengthened by a portion of the pia mater, which is named the tila of the fourth ventricle. The tenae of the fourth ventricle, tenae ventriculi corto, ligula, are two narrow bands of white matter, one on either side, which complete the lower part of the roof of the cavity. Each consists of a vertical and a horizontal part. The vertical part is continuous below the obex with the clava, to which it is adherent by a lateral border. The horizontal portion extends transversely across the inferior peduncle, below the striae medullares, and roofs in the lower and posterior part of the lateral recess. It is attached by its lower margin to the inferior peduncle and partly encloses the choroid plexus, which, however, projects beyond it like a cluster of grapes, and hence this part of the tenae has been termed the cornucopia, Bochdalik. The obex is a thin triangular gray lamina which roofs in the lower angle of the ventricle and is attached by its lateral margins to the clavae. The tila of the fourth ventricle is the name applied to the triangular fold of pia mater, which is carried upward between the cerebellum and the medulla oblongata. It consists of two layers which are continuous with each other in front and are more or less adherent throughout. The posterior layer covers the anterior-inferior surface of the cerebellum, while the anterior is applied to the structures which form the lower part of the roof of the ventricle, and is continued inferiorly with the pia mater on the inferior peduncles and closed part of the medulla. Choroid plexuses. These consist of two highly vascular inflections of the tila which invaginate the lower part of the roof of the ventricle and are everywhere covered by the epithelial lining of the cavity. Each consists of a vertical and a horizontal portion. The former lies close to the middle line, and the latter passes into the lateral recess and projects beyond its apex. The vertical parts of the plexuses are distinct from each other, but the horizontal portions are joined in the middle line, and hence the entire structure presents the form of the letter T, the vertical limb of which, however, is double. Openings in the roof. In the roof of the fourth ventricle, there are three openings, a medial and two lateral. The medial aperture, foramen majandi, is situated immediately above the inferior angle of the ventricle. The lateral apertures, foramina of Luschka, are found at the extremities of the lateral recesses. By means of these three openings, the ventricle communicates with the subarachnoid cavity, and the cerebrospinal fluid can circulate from the one to the other. Rhomboid fossa. Fossa rhomboidea, floor of the fourth ventricle. The anterior part of the fourth ventricle is named, from its shape, the rhomboid fossa, and its anterior wall, formed by the back of the pons and medulla oblongata, constitutes the floor of the fourth ventricle. It is covered by a thin layer of gray substance, continuous with that of the medulla spinalis. Superficial to this is a thin lamina of neuroglia which constitutes the ependema of the ventricle and supports a layer of ciliated epithelium. The fossa consists of three parts, superior, intermediate, and inferior. The superior part is triangular in shape and limited laterally by the superior cerebellar peduncle. Its apex, directed upward, is continuous with the cerebral aqueduct. Its base is represented by an imaginary line at the level of the upper ends of the superior foveae. The intermediate part extends from this level to that of the horizontal portions of the tenae of the ventricle. It is narrow above, where it is limited laterally by the medial peduncle, but widens below and is prolonged into the lateral recesses of the ventricle. The inferior part is triangular, and its downwardly directed apex, named the calamus scriptorius, is continuous with the central canal of the closed port of the medulla oblongata. The rhomboid fossa is divided into symmetrical halves by a median sulcus, which reaches from the upper to the lower angles of the fossa and is deeper below than above. On either side of this sulcus is an elevation, the medial eminence, bounded laterally by a sulcus, the sulcus limitans. In the superior part of the fossa, the medial eminence has a width equal to that of the corresponding half of the fossa, but opposite the superior fovea, it forms an elongated swelling, the colliculus facialis, which overlies the nucleus of the abducent nerve, and is, in part at least, produced by the ascending portion of the root of the facial nerve. In the inferior part of the fossa, the medial eminence assumes the form of a triangular area, the trigonum hypoglossai. When examined underwater with a lens, this trigone is seen to consist of a medial and a lateral area separated by a series of oblique furrows. The medial area corresponds with the upper part of the nucleus of the hypoglossal nerve, the lateral, with a small nucleus, the nucleus intercalatus. The sulcus limitans forms the lateral boundary of the medial eminence. In the superior part of the rhomboid fossa, it corresponds with the lateral limit of the fossa and presents a bluish-gray area, the locus ceruleus, which owes its color to an underlying patch of deeply pigmented nerve cells termed the substantia ferruginea. At the level of the colliculus facialis, the sulcus limitans widens into a flattened depression, the superior fovea, and in the inferior part of the fossa appears as a distinct dimple, the inferior fovea. Lateral to the foveae is a rounded elevation named the area acoustica, which extends into the lateral recess and there forms a feebly marked swelling, the tuberculum acousticum. Winding around the inferior peduncle and crossing the area acoustica and the medial eminence are a number of white strands, the striae medullares, which form a portion of the cochlear division of the acoustic nerve and disappear into the median sulcus. Below the inferior fovea and between the trigonum hypoglossi and the lower part of the area acoustica is a triangular dark field, the alis cinerea, which corresponds to the sensory nucleus of the vagus and glossopharyngeal nerves. The lower end of the alis cinerea is crossed by a narrow translucent ridge, the funiculus separans, and between this funiculus and the clava is a small tongue-shaped area, the area postrema. On section, it is seen that the funiculus separans is formed by a strip of thickened ependema, and the area postrema by loose, highly vascular neuroglial tissue containing nerve cells of moderate size. End of section 11.